My boss's son had no clue I spoke 7 languages. He fired me on the spot, but the next day, the CEO asked, "Why did you let him go? Didn't you see the contract?" The CEO's son responded, "Wait, what? I will make him regret it." I strongly disliked his behavior. He said, "You must choose between being terminated or demoted." I was stunned when the executive vice president, Chris, spoke to me in that manner. Tomorrow is the final stage of the business deal, and he suddenly demanded to take over my role as the lead negotiator. I never anticipated such an emotional outburst from him. "What's the problem? This is your fault. You're being punished for outperforming me." Chris, who is the same age as me, just couldn't handle my success. I have no desire to work for a company where my superiors steal my accomplishments. I'm resigning. I'll leave tomorrow's negotiation to you, Executive Vice President. With that, I quickly exited the conference room. Just before the negotiation, President John appeared puzzled as his son Chris proudly declared he would handle it himself. "What do you mean? Mark was supposed to manage this matter." "I fired him yesterday," Chris said proudly, causing his father to glare at him. "Why did you fire him? Didn't you review the negotiation materials?" Part 2. Frantically flipping through the documents, Chris found a critical sentence he had overlooked, and his face turned pale. "My name is Mark, a 43-year-old employee. I've actually switched jobs 3 times already, but it wasn't due to layoffs or a company's closure. The real reason is a bit complicated, so I often said it was for career progression." During my 4th interview, most employers accepted this explanation without issue. However, one person, Vice President David, saw through my statement. "No, that's not the case," he said. "You don't seem like the type to change jobs solely for career advancement, and if that were the reason, you'd be aiming higher. Our company and your previous one are similar in size, just dealing with different products. What's the real motivation behind your job changes?" Realizing honesty was the best approach, I shrugged and shared the true reason with him. David listened intently, considering my explanation. "I understand your reasoning and why you concealed it. All right, I'll take care of it." With a sly grin, David concluded the interview, leaving me uncertain if I had met the requirements. I anxiously waited a couple of days, and when the notification arrived, I was stunned. It stated that they wanted to hire me as a sales manager. What does this mean? I applied for a supervisory position in the sales department. Panicked, I called to clarify if there was a mistake. David laughed heartily. "The current sales manager is about to retire. Given your background, Mark, there's no issue with you taking his place. Furthermore, a manager's role is to lead, not to be led. You understand what I mean, right?" Comprehending David's reasoning, I gratefully accepted the job offer. The workplace I joined was not at all uncomfortable. I found it peculiar that there were few employees my age, but interacting with the younger staff was refreshing. Even though I entered with a managerial status, I anticipated facing challenges with the transition, but there were no issues whatsoever. My younger leadership style was preferred by my team, who valued my openness to new ideas. However, one individual, EVP Chris, took issue with my approach when I started giving orders after the previous sales manager's retirement. Chris openly criticized me, insisting that I should have sought his instructions before submitting the monthly business negotiation reports to the executive meeting. The other executives were puzzled by Chris's complaint, and I had no choice but to ask him directly what instructions he was referring to. Feeling frustrated, Chris unleashed a barrage of complaints towards me. He warned, "You were new to the role, like an inexperienced driver. Before you make any decisions, check with me or the other executives first." Comparing my extensive experience to a rookie driver was quite a stretch. As I pondered how to respond, David skillfully intervened. David vouched for me, stating that my predecessor, EVP Chris, endorsed me. He also mentioned that the sales staff found me easier to work with. Now convinced, the other executives agreed, but President John remained dissatisfied. Chris faced reprimand for his outburst. John advised, "Talented people can't perform well if constantly second-guessed." Moving forward, he stated that the sales department would handle all negotiations. Mark understood and seemed ready to take on the responsibility. However, it appeared Chris was frustrated that David and John had backed me up, as he began causing minor disruptions across the department. "How many times has this happened now?" I wondered. I noticed a growing sense of frustration on my team's faces lately. It seemed like we were constantly facing small but persistent obstacles, samples for negotiations arriving late, or promotional material going missing. Even though the sales department handles the negotiations, we rely heavily on the support of other departments like materials and general affairs. Lately, that support has been lacking. I believe the root of the issue lies with Chris. Each department has its own supervisors, but no one seems to go against Chris's directives. Whenever he instructs them to delay samples or prioritize other orders, they comply. I can't entirely blame them, but it would have been helpful if they had at least informed the sales team ahead of time. My team has been trying to work around these challenges using alternative samples or other solutions. However, we've now uncovered what appears to be deliberate sabotage that could jeopardize our negotiations. We had reserved a hotel room for a meeting, but the reservation was suddenly canceled. When we followed up with the hotel, they told us that someone from our company had canceled it. I have no doubt that Chris is behind this. Confronting Chris directly was the only way to address the sabotage and prevent further delays in the negotiations. Despite his denials, the evidence clearly pointed to his involvement in the last-minute hotel room cancellation. Determined to uncover the truth, I entered his office ready to confront him. As expected, he claimed ignorance, blaming it on a simple mistake by my team. However, the facts didn't align with his story. The sudden cancellation, the limited knowledge of the room details, and the finance department's connection to Chris all suggested his culpability. Faced with the mounting evidence, Chris fell silent, unable to refute the accusations. Informing our clients about the change could raise suspicions, but I couldn't let his actions jeopardize the team's hard work. Resolving this issue was crucial to ensuring the success of the negotiations. I recognized the significance of the upcoming negotiation, so I chose to prioritize securing its successful completion over confronting Chris more forcefully. This negotiation is crucial, and any further interference from you will leave me no choice but to escalate the matter to the president. I can provide the recorded call as evidence at the executive meeting. Although Chris appeared to back down, I couldn't dismiss the possibility of him continuing his disruptive actions. True to my concerns, he decided to usurp control of the negotiation at the worst possible moment. Despite the challenges we'd already overcome, such as the hotel room change, the negotiation was nearing its conclusion, and I had expected the top executives to finalize the contract the following day. However, first thing in the morning, Chris summoned me to his office and declared, "I cannot entrust this important negotiation to you. I will take over. You need to worry about it." "I don't understand what's wrong," I said, perplexed. Chris frowned. "That's the issue. Why can't you simply follow your boss's instructions? You have a choice. Get fired or be demoted. We don't require your services for this job." I was taken aback. Tomorrow was the final stage of the negotiations, and Chris's demand to take over the situation left me speechless. I never anticipated such an emotional outburst from him. "What's the problem?" "You're being punished for outshining me," Chris said, revealing his jealousy. Chris, being the same age as me, couldn't tolerate my success. He had been secretly sabotaging me, and now, seeing me close to sealing the deal, he decided to act directly. When I remained silent, Chris spoke with a gleeful expression. "You were getting arrogant just because you can speak English, right? Your resume shows you've worked at 3 different trading companies. We have plenty of people who can speak English at your level." I almost asked how he knew the details of my resume, but then I realized that HR was also under Chris's control. He must have forced the HR manager to show it to him. "What's your point?" I asked calmly. "I can converse in English proficiently, so there's no need for your involvement in tomorrow's negotiations." He mistakenly thought my business English abilities were crucial for sealing the deal. While his misconception was rather amusing, I didn't feel inclined to correct him. Besides, I had no attachment to a company where superiors took undue credit. "I'm quitting. The upcoming negotiation is all yours, even PP." With that, I hastily left the conference room, angry and determined to pack my belongings. As I headed toward the sales department, I ran into David. "What's wrong? You seem upset," he said, sensing something was amiss. David invited me to his office and asked for an explanation, so I recounted all of Chris's wrongdoings, including the previous act of sabotage. After listening to everything, David closed his eyes and contemplated the situation. I braced myself for him to dismiss my concerns, but then he spoke, his tone tinged with bitterness. "Chris has done it again." "I'm confused," I responded. David didn't give a direct answer and instead asked, "Didn't you notice anything unusual in those executive meetings?" I felt puzzled by his question. David then explained, "Except for you, no one else in your age group attended those meetings." At first, I assumed it was because those positions are typically held by older individuals, but then I realized it doesn't make sense. Even for a medium-sized trading firm, it's strange that someone younger than Chris would be excluded. I voiced my growing suspicions. There must be plenty of capable younger people than the executive vice president. David frowned and slowly nodded. Chris joined the company around 5 years ago when his previous employer went under. The president's ex-wife asked him to come on board, so he reluctantly brought Chris in. Now that the president has remarried, Chris knows this fuels his rivalry with the younger men. That's why Chris and John have different last names, even though they're family. Despite this background, I still struggled to understand. David continued with a bitter smile. "You might not get it because you're skilled, but Chris came from a completely different industry with no real expertise. The man's youthful appearance serves as his secret weapon, despite his advancing years. Before you came aboard, he would make grand proclamations about appealing to the younger crowd without any evidence to back it up. The seasoned executives would listen, assuming he knew what he was talking about. It becomes clear that having a peer around would challenge his position. Instead of earning qualifications or attending training, he took the easier path by eliminating his rivals. He believed his opinions would carry more weight as a result. Employees in their late 30s and 40s who held supervisory roles became his targets. Any noticeable behavior from them was met with harassment or false accusations. Those with a healthy sense of self-preservation had no choice but to resign. This has led to a workforce dominated by either the company president, who is older, or fresh-faced young staff just starting their careers. Now I understood the situation clearly. Chris was like a seasoned office bully, undermining his colleagues to maintain his status as the youngest one present. These underhanded tactics only became apparent when the victims were about to leave. I had mentioned this to the president, but he couldn't believe his own son would be so petty and jealous. The president dismissed the idea as unbelievable. The company's website boasted that John had built the business from the ground up, making it a fierce competitor in the industry. John couldn't comprehend Chris's mindset, which prioritized being the youngest over actual competence. However, I knew all too well what would happen if the situation was left unchecked. My previous employer failed because they ignored similar jealousy. I decided it was time to confront David directly. "Executive Vice President David, what are your goals for this company?" I asked. David looked puzzled. "My goals? Well, I hope we can keep increasing our revenue and profits. The president's successor is also very capable, even though he's still a student." David's eyes seemed to plead with me to overlook Chris's harassment for the time being. Given David's long tenure, he probably didn't want to stir up trouble in a comfortable environment. Leaving the status quo behind was a bold move. During our conversation, I revealed to David something I hadn't mentioned even in my interview. "Do you know why I changed jobs 3 times?" I inquired. "Fired," David nodded, acknowledging. "Yes, you mentioned being forced out due to jealousy. While it was unfortunate, we've gained a talented individual because of it." Taking a deep breath, I continued. "The reality is that those 3 companies no longer exist. They've split, dissolved, or filed for bankruptcy. They're no longer operating." Surprise, David's expression shifted. "That can't be. When we conducted a background check, those companies were still thriving." "If you have any doubts, I encourage you to check their websites now," I suggested. David promptly pulled out his smartphone and began searching. His face grew increasingly shocked with each passing moment. "You're absolutely right, but how could this have happened?" "It's quite simple," I explained. "The individuals who drove me out became more confident and repeated the same actions toward others. Imagine the consequences when that cycle continues." I spoke calmly yet firmly. A company cannot function without its people. If the people inside abandon it, the company cannot sustain itself. I continued to speak with David, whose expression had become serious. "If this situation persists, the company will eventually face the same unfortunate outcome. Truthfully, Chris's harassment is minor compared to what I've endured in previous workplaces, but it's becoming a significant problem. Chris has pushed me to either lose my job or be demoted. If I resign, it would be a victory for Chris, and he's likely to repeat this behavior. The future outlook is not promising." Whether my words resonated with him or not, David fell silent for a moment before firmly nodding. "I understand your perspective. I won't simply stand by and watch anymore. Sabotaging the company out of jealousy is no laughing matter." I felt relieved with David on my side. We could take drastic measures if necessary. After consulting with him, I headed to HR with a lighter step to retrieve the resignation paperwork. Just before the negotiation, John appeared puzzled as Chris's son proudly declared he would handle it. "What do you mean? This was supposed to be handled by Mark." "I fired him yesterday," Chris's son stated proudly. John glared at him. "It's fine. I can communicate in English as well. The only remaining step is to sign the contract. Here's a paraphrased version of the given text, maintaining the same length as the original. Why have you let him go? Didn't he review the negotiation documents? The top executives from the other company are arriving today. How will you manage without him?" Chris, who thought it was just a formality, was stunned by John's outburst. He frantically flipped through the documents and discovered a crucial sentence he had overlooked. A look of concern spread across his face. An hour before the negotiation, I received a call. They already knew I wasn't there since the morning. The call met Chris, who had been searching for a last-minute replacement, but of course he hadn't found one. Despite John's constant reprimands, Chris still didn't understand. I answered the call with a faint yawn. "What's the matter?" "I got the resignation paperwork from HR yesterday. I'll fill it out and send it in the next day or 2, but I'm taking paid leave today, so I'm not coming in." "You don't need to resign. Just come to the hotel right now." Chris's desperate voice made me chuckle. "Executive Vice President, isn't this quite different from what you said yesterday? Didn't you boast that you didn't need me?" "I didn't know the contract would be an error," Chris stammered. I could imagine Chris turning pale. He must have just realized the contract was an error, a fact clearly stated in the negotiation documents. If he had been involved from the start and reviewed the documents, he would have known this. Our new client was a top-tier company from the Middle East with a highly nationalistic CEO. Now you can watch the second part by pressing share and more. Update 3. Coming from the Middle East with a highly nationalistic CEO, their official language was Arabic, and they only accepted documents in Arabic. In a globalized world, trying to do business solely in your native language is impractical. That's why we always conducted negotiations in English with foreign companies. Only the agent with authority would be involved, and top executives would stay in the background, appearing only at the end. Despite being a top-notch company with a desirable market, few international partnerships existed because many couldn't overcome this hurdle. However, I had made a good impression from the start by negotiating in Arabic. My specialty is speaking 7 languages, and telling a joke in Arabic is a piece of cake for me. If the negotiations suddenly changed and the top executive, who had been assured by their agent of our reliability, was only addressed in English, it would clearly be a disaster. The top executive would feel insulted, and the deal would fall through. The documents clearly stated everything. Chris's claim of ignorance was no excuse. I had already dismissed him, and now he was desperate. He accused me of fraud because I didn't list every skill on my resume. I couldn't help but laugh. Fraudulent hiring? Seriously? Not listing all my qualifications isn't fraud. Besides, I never claimed to only speak English. Chris, with a resentful tone, asked why I didn't highlight such a skill. If he had the same skill, he would brag about it. That's the difference between us. I didn't owe him an explanation. More pressing was the negotiation. If things continued like this, it was bound to fall apart. I heard Chris growling and grinding his teeth as he spoke. He said he'd step down and tell his father, "Who's the president?" I asked him to put his father on speakerphone and explain why he tried to remove me from the negotiation. When Chris started speaking, I knew I'd won. The negotiation was successfully concluded. I arrived at the hotel room 10 minutes late and began the negotiation. I advised Chris to avoid speaking English for those 10 minutes. Amusingly, he had memorized the Arabic phrase, "Mark will be here soon," and kept repeating it. David had booked me a room on another floor, anticipating the situation. Although I could have arrived on time, David suggested arriving late to teach Chris a lesson. Americans are often late, so I joked about it. Discussing time differences between Arabs and Americans helped the conversation flow smoothly. Once the conversation became enjoyable, the contract was practically signed. After seeing off our guests, I took a deep breath. Chris, who had been frozen in the corner, slumped into a chair, exhausted from the tension. John thanked me and apologized for Chris's behavior. He said they'd imposed disciplinary actions on Chris. Chris fell silent under John's glare. John mentioned discussing the disciplinary actions when we returned to the office. Back at the office, David, who had been called to the president's office, smiled when he saw me. "Everything went well, judging by your expression," he said. "Was the hotel comfortable?" "Thanks to you, I slept very well," I replied, seeing John's puzzled look. David laughed and explained, "Chris told Mark he was either going to be promoted or demoted. We couldn't lose him, so we needed you to understand his misconduct. We asked him to help expose the company's issues." I added, "If I had reported Chris's actions myself, you'd have been skeptical. Even when David told you, you didn't take it seriously." John looked embarrassed. "You're right, I apologize. We had to corner Chris to get him to confess." John turned and shouted at Chris, "I took you in when you had nowhere else to go, and this is how you repay me? It's like being bitten by my own dog. Write your resignation letter today, but you can stay until you find another job." John's glare made Chris tremble. "If you don't want to resign, you can be fired. You had no problem threatening Mark with the same choice." Chris quickly agreed. "Okay, I'll write it." I struggled to suppress my laughter as Chris rushed to HR. His resignation was processed immediately. At the next week's morning meeting, John detailed Chris's misdeeds and announced that those who aided him would face consequences. Those who had reluctantly helped Chris were transferred to lesser positions, and some resigned under scrutiny. The company's hiring approach shifted, bringing in individuals in their 30s and 40s, which proved to be a positive change. This allowed young employees who had previously felt constrained to thrive. Removing Chris from the equation revitalized the company. However, Chris now struggles to find a job, facing the consequences of his past actions. While understanding the need for decisive measures, John was curious about why I had kept my ability to speak 7 languages a secret, as it could be a valuable asset in job searching. I chuckled and explained that for me, it had been more of a hindrance than a benefit. Throughout my student years, I had developed a deep passion for languages, becoming fluent in 7 by the time I graduated. I initially used this skill to secure a job after graduation, but soon found myself confined to interpretation and translation tasks. Despite my desire to take on more involved roles in negotiations, I was restricted to merely interpreting conversations for the executives, even when I knew how to improve a deal. I was not allowed to voice my opinions. Frustrated, I requested a transfer, but my superior denied it, stating that an interpreter only needs a functioning mouth, not necessarily intelligence. They whispered about me when I wasn't around and criticized me whenever I stumbled. Although I was summoned to key discussions, they mistakenly believed I was receiving special treatment, which made them resentful. I realized that staying would have been disastrous, so I left. This pattern repeated itself at the next 2 companies I worked for. I was taken advantage of, faced jealousy, and experienced resentment. To avoid this, I decided to downplay my language abilities during the interview process. At the 4th company, David saw through that immediately. Mark shared how the companies crumbled after his departure, driven by jealousy and extreme actions. The situation with EVP Chris was a prime example. Fearing our company might face a similar fate if we pushed Mark out, we collaborated on a drastic solution. John expressed his gratitude, saying, "Thank you for your dedication to the company, and thank you, Mark. I'll repay you both someday." He shook our hands firmly. John kept his promise. The following year, David became the president and John advanced to the role of chairman. David served as the interim president until the issues were cleared, and he was highly satisfied with the outcome. I was also promoted from sales manager to executive vice president. However, since I still manage the sales department, the hectic business pace remains unchanged. My current focus is to develop reliable subordinates to share the workload. Utilizing my linguistic abilities, I refuse to limit their application solely for expedience. I firmly uphold the responsibility of those in positions of authority to nurture the development of diverse talents, and I conscientiously apply this principle in the execution of my daily duties. Help me to reach 1,000 subscribers.